Histobiograph.
She was only 12 when they forced her into marriage. At 13, she was pregnant, her small body breaking under the weight of a child she never chose. She nearly died bringing that boy into the world. But she lived, and the girl they tried to silence became the woman who shaped a kingdom. This is Margaret Bowford, from broken child to the mother of a dynasty. The Tudor dynasty was built on the broken body of a child bride. The midwife's hands were slick with blood as she pressed trembling fingers into the narrow hips of a girl barely into adolescence, whispering desperate prayers to saints who no longer listened. Outside Pembroke Castle, the winter storm roared, shaking stone and soul alike. But inside that chamber, true agony took shape, not in the clash of swords or the moan of war, but in the sharp, helpless screams of a 13-year-old girl. Her name was Margaret Bowford, and she was dying. She had been screaming for hours. Her underdeveloped body strained to perform a task it was never meant to face so soon. Her bones had not finished forming. Her womb had barely awakened. And yet, she was giving birth, not just to a baby, but to an empire. The child inside her would become Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. But at what cost? Margaret's screams didn't echo through history like her son's proclamations. Her agony was not painted on canvas or carved into marble. It was forgotten, or worse, erased. But we remember. And that's why you're heir. Because this isn't just another royal story. This is the horror at the heart of the Tudor Rose. The truth they tried to silence. The pain they buried under titles and thrones. If these stories matter to you, if you believe history should speak not just of kings, but of the girls they buried to build thrones, subscribe to Histobiograph 365. We uncover the truths they tried to burn, bury, and forget. Margaret Beaufort was 12 when her husband, Edmund Tudor, a man of 24, made a choice that would shape the fate of England. He refused to wait. He forced a child to carry his heir, not because of love or lust, but because of property law. If she died without a child, her fortune returned to her family. If she gave birth, he kept it all. That's not romance. That's not politics. That's a calculation. That's greed, weaponized against a girl. And so she lay there, tiny, trembling, torn apart, while the baby fought to exit a body too narrow, too young, too fragile. The midwives had seen hundreds of births. But this was something else. One later wrote that it was a miracle that someone so little a personage could survive. But miracles are just tragedies someone got lucky enough to live through. Let me ask you something. What if this birth wasn't just a moment of suffering? What if it was the origin of a dynasty? What if, beneath every Tudor crown, beneath every royal seal, anthem, and war cry, there was a girl no one was ever supposed to remember? Because that's what this story is really about. Not kings, not castles, not glory, but a girl who should have been playing with dolls, screaming into the night as her body was shattered to give England its future. The dynasty was born that day, but so was a ghost. A blood-soaked specter that would haunt Margaret Beaufort for the rest of her life. She would rise. She would rule from behind the throne. She would build colleges, command armies, bend the will of kings. But she would never forget, and neither should we. So next time someone tells you the Tudors were destined, tell them about the 13-year-old girl who was never meant to survive. The girl whose scream became the first sound of a new England. Coming up next, the marriage contract that sealed her fate, and the priest who looked the other way. She wasn't born into safety. She was born into strategy. From the moment Margaret Beaufort took her first breath, men were already calculating how to sell her, how to use her. She wasn't a daughter. She was an asset. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, should have guaranteed her protection. But within a year of her birth, he was dead, and the whispers that followed said only one word: suicide. In medieval England, that wasn't just a sin. It was a curse. It didn't just haunt the soul, it stained the bloodline. Margaret, still in a cradle, suddenly became vulnerable. Not just as a child, but as a symbol of scandal and a prize. Because even as a baby, she owned land, titles, and money, more wealth than most grown men could ever touch. She was defenseless, but irresistible. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, tried to shield her. She raised her close, taught her to read French, to think sharply, to behave with grace. For a brief time, there was a chance this story might end differently. But power doesn't rest long, and the king was watching. When Margaret was just 3 years old, King Henry VI took her, not by force, with ink. With a royal grant, he handed her over to William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, a man who knew exactly what Margaret was worth and exactly how to exploit it. Suffolk didn't waste time. He married Margaret, age 3, to his own son, John, age 7. A toddler bride. A political transaction. It's hard to say if Margaret even understood what was happening, but understanding wasn't required. Consent wasn't required. They needed papal approval because the children were cousins. The Pope granted it. The Church blessed it. And no one questioned why a 3-year-old was wearing a wedding ring. Let that sink in. An English court arranged a marriage between children and got Vatican approval. The system wasn't failing. The system was the abuse. The plan was simple. Connect Suffolk's family to Margaret's fortune, raise them both, and when the time came, merge the wealth and power permanently. But history had other plans. By 1450, Suffolk had been arrested. His political enemies seized him, humiliated him, and finally, executed him. His body was thrown into the sea, and his ambitions drowned with him. With Suffolk gone, Margaret's marriage was dissolved. At age 6, she was already a widow. A political widow. Free again, but not safe. Because now, Margaret was back on the market. And this time, more powerful men were watching. That's when King Henry VI gave her away again. This time to his own half-brothers, the Tudors, Edmund and Jasper, sons of his mother's secret marriage to a Welsh servant. They weren't princes, but they were close. And they were ambitious. Edmund Tudor didn't see a girl. He saw a gate, a bloodline, a shortcut to power. Margaret was 12. Edmund was 24. And when the wedding happened on November 1st, 1455, no one protested. But here's what matters. Even in the 15th century, consummating a child marriage at age 12 was controversial. Noble families usually waited until the girl turned 14. Not out of mercy, but out of medical fear. They knew childbirth killed young girls. Edmund didn't care. By April 1456, Margaret was pregnant. That's 5 months after the wedding. Which means it happened quickly, deliberately, possibly on the wedding night itself. Why? Because under English law, if Margaret died childless, her fortune returned to her family. But if she gave birth, just once, Edmund would keep everything for life. So he did the math. He gambled a child's life for an estate, and everyone let it happen. The king, the nobles, the priests who blessed the union. They didn't object because they all saw Margaret as one thing, a womb attached to wealth. The girl who'd once been protected with books and soft hands now had no say at all. She was no longer being groomed for greatness. She was being prepared for labor. And what grew inside her wasn't just a child. It was a weapon, a dynasty seed, something to be claimed. She likely didn't even understand what was happening to her body. The sickness, the fear, the way her skin stretched across a frame still in formation. No one explained. No one comforted. They just watched and waited. In July 1456, Edmund Tudor was captured during the Wars of the Roses. He died in captivity a few months later. Margaret, now 13 and 7 months pregnant, was completely alone. She could have stayed in Llandaff. But instead, she rode, pregnant, grieving, surrounded by war, to reach Jasper Tudor at Pembroke Castle. That decision alone says something. Not about ambition. About survival. She wasn't just delivering a child. She was trying to stay alive. That winter, she arrived, cold, exhausted, and broken. But the worst was still to come. The storm outside Pembroke Castle screamed, but nothing matched the cries within. 13-year-old Margaret Bowford was in labor, and the room was drowning in fear. Her body was small, her bones narrow, her hips not yet shaped for childbirth. But the baby didn't wait, just like the man who had placed it inside her. She had come here alone, 7 months pregnant, and already widowed. Her journey through the Welsh winter was desperate, but it wasn't the road that would nearly kill her. Inside the stone chamber, midwives moved with urgency. They had helped countless women before, but never someone so young, so slight, so close to breaking. This wasn't a mother giving birth. This was a child being crushed under the weight of a future she never asked for. The baby was stuck. Time slowed as the pain deepened. The candles flickered, and the air turned cold, even as her skin burned with agony. Then, after hours of silence and screaming, the child came. A boy, alive. They named him Henry. But Margaret, she never recovered. Not fully. Not ever. Her priest, John Fisher, would later call it a miracle, that a child could be born of so little a personage. But no one asked what happened to the personage after. No one cared what the miracle cost. Margaret never had another child. She remarried, twice, but her womb remained silent. One birth was all her body could take. Modern medicine explains what history ignored. A girl that age can suffer pelvic trauma, tissue tearing, and lifelong complications. She likely endured internal damage, injuries no one saw or treated. She simply survived, and that was enough for them. Her suffering was never written down. Only the boy mattered. Only the dynasty. But pain doesn't fade when ignored. It carves itself into muscle, into memory. Margaret emerged from that room changed. She was no longer a girl. She was a vessel, emptied and cold. Yet she endured, and she poured everything into Henry. He wasn't just her child. He was her proof that she had lived. She managed his alliances, shaped his image, and watched his every move. Her grip on him wasn't soft. It was forged in survival. Witnesses heard her call him my only one. Not in affection, but as a reminder. The only one she could have. The only one who justified her pain. She didn't remarry for love. Her later husbands were tools, placeholders, never partners. She didn't build a family. She built a throne. Because power felt safer than tenderness. Her life was strategy. Because emotion got girls killed. Silence, on the other hand, got things done. But she never forgot. Not the cold. Not the tearing. Not the echoing stone walls of Pembroke. What she survived wasn't rare. Just rarely spoken of. Most girls died quietly. Margaret lived. And that made her dangerous. Because she now understood the rules and would never be ruled again. So next time someone says the Tudors were destined, remember, they began with a girl who nearly died for a crown she would never wear. She survived the birth. That made her exceptional. Not because she was strong, but because most girls didn't. Margaret Bowford walked out of Pembroke Castle a different creature. No longer a child, not yet a queen, but already something the world didn't know how to name. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She studied. She had learned one thing in that room. Silence is survival. They saw her as a grieving widow. A quiet girl with royal ties. What they didn't see was how quickly she started writing letters. She used the only tools they couldn't take from her. Her name, her knowledge, and the baby she had nearly died for. Jasper Tudor offered protection, but Margaret offered strategy. She wasn't being protected anymore. She was positioning herself. She built bridges across both sides of the Civil War. Lancastrians, Yorkists, it didn't matter. Her loyalty wasn't to a faction. It was to one life. Henry. She didn't seek a crown. She sought protection for her son's bloodline. And she knew that protection didn't come from love. It came from leverage. She moved between households like smoke. Unseen, but impossible to ignore once she'd passed. She married again. Thomas Stanley. A powerful lord. A calculated move. It gave her cover. Access. Freedom. But not affection. That part of her had died in the room where Henry was born. Still, she remembered what it was like to be 13 and alone. And she tried, in her way, to stop it from happening again. When her granddaughter Margaret Tudor was betrothed at 13, Margaret Bowford intervened. She wrote to her son, King Henry VII. The Queen and I are against it. We fear he may not wait. She remembered exactly what not waiting meant. She remembered the cold floor, the silence. But even now, as the king's mother, she couldn't stop it. The marriage went ahead. That failure haunted her. Even with power, she couldn't change the rules. And yet, she never stopped trying. She used politics as a shield, strategy as armor. She signed letters as Margaret R. It wasn't rebellion. It was truth. She ruled behind the throne. She arranged alliances. She silenced threats. And all the while, she kept building something permanent: colleges, chapels, legacies. She wanted a future that didn't require sacrifice. But she knew that was a dream. The system that had broken her would keep breaking others. So she remained where she could do the most damage. Behind the curtain, at the center of everything. Not as a mother, not as a queen, as a shadow with memory. And in that memory was always a stone chamber, a birth bed, and a silence that changed the crown. In her final years, Margaret Bowford had outlived every man who once held power over her. She had seen her son wear the crown and her grandson born into royalty, but no crown could erase the blood she had shed to get them there. Publicly, she was serene, powerful, composed. But in the quiet spaces, between letters, behind chapel doors. She carried the weight of a story she never told in full. She spent her wealth not on jewels or monuments, but on knowledge. Colleges, chapels, scholarships, built not to glorify her name, but to outlive her pain. Some said it was legacy, others whispered guilt. But perhaps, deep down, it was something simpler. She wanted the silence she had endured to serve someone else's future. Margaret rarely spoke of Edmund Tudor, the husband who had set her fate in motion. Yet when she prepared for death, she asked to be buried beside him, not her other husbands, only him. Historians have puzzled over that decision. Was it love? Gratitude? But maybe it was resignation. A final surrender to a life shaped by choices she never made. Her confessor, John Fisher, understood more than most. He saw her as a woman of discipline, yes, but also of memory. He heard what she couldn't say publicly, and in his funeral sermon, he spoke of her childbirth as a miracle. But miracles have costs. He knew that what emerged from her that day, Henry, was not all that had been born. Pain, silence, and strategy had entered the world with him. In the letters Margaret left behind, she used phrases that hinted at inner conflict. She wrote of the burden of birth, of duty sealed in pain, and of a debt to be made worthy. She never detailed what that burden was. She didn't need to. Every action she took, every institution she founded, was a quiet confession, written not in ink, but in intent. As she aged, her writing changed. The lines grew shorter, the topics more eternal. She no longer wrote about court politics. She wrote about justice, about mercy, about memory. She feared that all she had done might not be enough, that even with the Tudor throne secured, the price she paid would be forgotten, and worse, repeated. Her final years were spent in prayer, not as penance, but as preservation. She no longer fought for control. She fought to be remembered, properly. She couldn't undo what had happened to her, but she could shape how it was echoed. She had tried to protect her granddaughter, to stop the cycle, and she had failed. That failure haunted her more than anything else. The most powerful woman in England still couldn't protect a girl from what she had once endured. That was the limit of power and the truth beneath legacy. Her real confession was never written down. It was carried in the way she looked at her son, in the way she whispered warnings to queens, and in the prayers she repeated when no one else was listening. Margaret didn't have to say the words aloud, because the world she left behind was already speaking them through the colleges, the records, and the girls still born into danger. Margaret Bowford died on June 29, 1509, 5 days after her 66th birthday, and just 2 months after her son's death. She left behind a dynasty, a legacy of colleges and kings, and a silence history rarely dared to disturb. The chronicles call her the king's mother, the founder, the lady of influence. But they don't call her what she truly was, the girl who screamed alone while birthing a crown. Her body was buried in Westminster Abbey, near the altar. Her tombstone was carved in Latin. It speaks of grace, wisdom, and piety. It says nothing about pain. There is no mention of the night she nearly died or the body that never recovered. There is no line that says, she was only 13. But history doesn't need to print the truth for it to echo. It lingers in the corridors she once ruled from, in the institutions she built, and in the lineage she made possible. We remember the Tudors for power, for drama, for blood on the throne. But we rarely remember that the first Tudor crown was paid for with the body of a girl who was never meant to be queen. Every time we speak of Henry VII, we speak of a child born through suffering. Every time we celebrate Elizabeth I, we celebrate a world that began with trauma. That matters, not because it makes their reigns less worthy, but because it makes our memory more honest. Margaret tried to create something lasting. She believed in education, in law, in the mind's power to outlive the body. She hoped her pain would be worth something beyond lineage. She couldn't save her granddaughter from being married young, but she left behind a map, a warning, written in the choices she made after. She didn't tear down the system, but she showed us where it broke her. And that's where we must begin to listen. We live in a world where girls are still forced into roles before they understand them, where power is still built on sacrifice, where history still forgets the quiet ones who bled to build it. Margaret's story reminds us that behind every dynasty is a body, behind every throne, a wound, and behind every legacy, someone who paid too much. She signed her letters, Margaret R. She built buildings that still stand. But the most important thing she left behind was a question. What if it wasn't worth it? What if power gained through suffering is a power we should never accept? We can't undo her pain, but we can decide not to romanticize it. We can choose to remember her as more than a mother of kings. We can remember her as a survivor, as a strategist, and as a girl who was failed by everyone around her, yet still refused to disappear. If we tell her story truthfully, maybe we won't need girls like her to suffer for greatness again. Maybe that is her real legacy. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe, share, and let history speak again. Because Margaret Beaufort was more than the mother of a king. She was the girl they tried to silence, and the woman who wouldn't let them.